Welcome back, everyone. And we will now proceed with our next panel, which will, as I indicated before we went to break, address some of the questions that were pervasive in the chat box during the last discussion, which includes the role of public engagement, social license to operate, and notions of stakeholder interests. And so to facilitate that, I am going to introduce the moderator for this panel, and she'll frame how we will proceed. The moderator is Elisa Graffy, who is a professor in the School for the Future of Innovation and Society in the Consortium for Science, Policy, and Outcomes at Arizona State University. Elisa?
Thank you, Will. So I'm going to now be brave and see if I can share my screen. Okay, Molly, my screen sharing is disabled.
Try again now. I was sharing my screen. You should be able to.
Okay, let me give it one more shot. Still not working. I'm happy to share the slides if Jen is around.
Try it again now. Sorry about that.
That's okay. Haha. Okay. All righty. Okay. So let me tell you a little bit about the session, and I'll just explain how Will and Brad and I are going to proceed and the role that you guys all get to play. So we've all been working in various spaces around CDR that have involved issues of public engagement and global human rights and justice and other things for a while, and have been watching this really interesting dynamic grow, in which public engagement and social license have been kind of conflated around CDR issues. And there's been a question about issues of justice and how they might be emerging, and whether they're completely separate or whether they have some relationship to the other two. So we're going to talk about that a little bit, and then we're going to bring it back to why exploring those intersections may be particularly important around issues of ocean-based CDR. And the way we're going to approach this is Will's going to do an overview for us about what some of the ocean-based CDR options are. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about just some of the basics of these three areas: public engagement, social license, and justice, so that we can sort of see why they are both related and have some tensions. And then Brad's going to dig straight into applications to oceans with some of the work that he's doing. And then what we'd like to do when we get through that is open it up so that all of you can participate, and we can start discussing outstanding questions, ideas for really important work or even mildly interesting work that should proceed in this space, because we think it's a growing and expanding one, and start to just have a little bit more of a interaction. Okay, so with that, I am going to, hang on one second. Ooh, I'm gonna, there we go. Okay, so here are the three of us. We'll show you this at the end, and I'm going to pass this off to Will now.
All right. Thank you very much, Elisa. And I'm having some bandwidth issues, so I'm going to stay off the screen for now as I briefly provide an overview of ocean-based approaches. Now, if I were in a more general audience, I'd do a lot of description of what the ocean-based approaches actually entail from a technological perspective. But looking through this audience, I know that most of you are steeped in that. So rather, what I want to focus on is the fact that when we look at ocean-based approaches, and I'm not going to encompass all of them, but I'm going to use a number of them as case studies. One of the things that's terribly clear is they present issues of opportunity costs as well as potential risks to an array of potential stakeholders or sovereigns. that certainly provide justification for building a strong framework for public education, public engagement, public deliberation, notions of social license to operate, and incorporation and an abiding consideration of notions of justice and equity at every juncture, beginning at the outset in terms of research considerations, as well as potential deployment of these options at a large scale in the future. Implicit to this panel also, I think, is our thesis that it is not entirely certain that these notions are widely being incorporated into considerations of research or potential deployment, but are critical. Critical from an ethical standpoint, from a standpoint of functions of democratic institutions, critical from a pragmatic standpoint of not ensuring a massive backlash against these options moving forward if the kind of scaffolding of public education and engagement does not occur at the outset. So I just want to look at these 4 examples of ocean-based approaches and talk about some of the things that would necessarily raise a rationale for public engagement, as well as a need for looking at notions of equity and justice and social license to operate. Ocean iron fertilization, for example. In cases where we might contemplate fertilizing the oceans with iron, for example, to stimulate phytoplankton production, it is possible that we could effectuate large-scale sequestration of carbon dioxide, albeit more controversial, I think, as the field experiments have spooled out. However, at the same time, there are some potential critical risks that necessarily require engagement with stakeholders. For example, ocean iron fertilization could potentially alter ecosystems. If you were to effectuate large-scale proliferation of phytoplankton species through iron fertilization, you wouldn't get to pick and choose which species necessarily thrived in those environments. And it's possible that some species might ultimately take over those systems and be unpalatable to zooplankton species in those ecosystems, which could result in a decline in zooplankton and a subsequent decline in species above them in the trophic layers, which could ultimately result in a biological cascade. This could have huge implications for fisheries communities, for example, or others that might rely on species such as marine mammals, and necessarily requires that those kind of stakeholders be engaged in considering the judiciousness of proceeding with this approach. Some studies indicate that ocean iron fertilization could potentially rob downstream areas of nutrients, which could have impacts, again, in terms of fishing communities in these areas. It could potentially produce toxic algal blooms that could have implications for coastal communities, or again, on open ocean-based ecosystems where stakeholders may be critically dependent on the resources in those areas. Alkalinity addition. It is possible, for example, that if one is able to shift alkalinity, it could ultimately result in substantial sequestration of carbon dioxide. At the same time, it could have huge energy requirements. It also could require huge amounts of mining for materials such as limestone and olivine, which could have adverse impacts, environmental impacts, and other social impacts in a large array of communities throughout the world. It's thus critical that those interests be heard at the outset, and that we try to minimize the potential impacts that could occur. It obviously also raises environmental justice implications, given the disproportionate impact that these facilities often have on the most vulnerable among us. It's also possible that certain marine organisms that aren't able to concentrate carbon within their cells under conditions of increased alkalinity would suffer adverse impacts. So again, this could have negative implications for stakeholders, including fishing communities. It could also, resulting in spontaneous precipitation of calcium hydroxide, adversely impact coral reefs because they're highly sensitive to high levels of turbidity. Again, it's critical to engage coastal communities that might be adversely impacted in under those conditions. Artificial upwelling and downwelling. Again, as studies indicate that there are potential risks associated with these approaches. You could see rapid increases in temperature with upwelling, because temperature decreases associated with this process would be reversed. Drawdowns of carbon dioxide in oceans might potentially exacerbate ocean acidification, which again could potentially impact fishing communities that should be consulted at the outset. It could restructure ocean ecosystems. It could favor large diatoms and result in a shift from nutrient poor to nutrient rich species, which again could have impact in terms of stakeholders in ocean resources. Finally, when we think about efforts to create large assemblages of macroalgae, either in coastal areas or in open oceans. Again, this could have potential benefits in terms of carbon sequestration, but it could also have adverse implications in some areas. Large assemblages of buoys, for example, in some cases, perhaps as many as 1 million buoys for large-scale development of kelp farms could adversely impact the migration of marine mammals. It potentially could interfere with shipping interests. It could result in large-scale opportunistic feeding by certain species that could outcompete other species in those areas. Again, potentially having impacts on the ecosystems in those areas. If you put 1 million buoys out into the open oceans, large amounts of invasive species may hitch a ride on those buoys, some of which may ultimately float into exclusive economic zones and potentially have impacts on other communities. All of these provide a rationale, including the large costs associated with some of these approaches, for having a full-throated public engagement process and full-throated discussion of the notions of how to balance the potential benefits with the potential threats to notions of equity and justice. And so I think it's important that very early in this process that we envision how this might happen. The National Academy of Science, in a number of its studies of marine geoengineering and non-marine geoengineering, has emphasized the need for this kind of public engagement, public deliberation. But to date, very little has been done to operationalize that. And so I'm hoping that this panel can provide a foundation for figuring out how we proceed. That's it, Elisa.
Yep, I know I had to unmute myself. Thanks, Will. Okay. I'm going to move on here. I'm going to minimize my screen here. So in the last session, and as a sort of a basis for this one, and Will already referred to it, we're talking about issues of stakeholders and decision makers and the legal and policy and cultural contexts within which CDR might be developed, researched, deployed, and in which oceans play a part with or without CDR. I want to talk a little bit about the kind of historical underpinnings and the ethical underpinnings of some of these things. Now, when I say ethical underpinnings, I'm not talking about a particular kind of ethical framework. So ethics isn't just like good or bad. It's good or bad or better or worse within a particular value structure. And there are multiple value structures. So one of the things that I want you to perhaps get some insight about as we go through the next few minutes is that the underlying value systems for each of these approaches, public participation, social license, and justice, are actually a little bit different, which means that their aspirations are a little bit different. And then the way that they go about engaging stakeholders and why they engage them and what their goals are, even for bringing stakeholders together, and the processes for doing so would be a little bit different. And so from that, we can see why they make some sense to talk about together, and they also have some inherent tensions in them. And it kind of shows us where we might be running into some confusion and barriers or ambiguity as we start trying to think about what the governance system would be or is for proceeding with some of these CDR ideas, even within a context in which we're worried about the urgency of climate crisis. So first of all, public participation has been around for a really long time. I mean, that concept and the theories and the approaches and methods have been around for a really long time. And I have a smattering here of terms that come out of that space. One thing is, why do you do it? And Will mentioned a couple of them, but I'll be just a little bit more systematic. You do it because you're looking for buy-in. You're looking for buy-in from the people who will be part of political coalitions for and against what you are doing, who are in the communities that will be, who may benefit or may be harmed, but you would like them on your side. So you want that buy-in, and if you get the buy-in, then the theory is you're going to reduce the chances of backlash later on. It doesn't always work out that way because things evolve, but that's the idea there. Another one is substantive, that you actually think that if you include stakeholders, that you're going to end up with better solutions, that substantively you're going to end up with a better outcome, and you want that. So you're crowdsourcing. You're doing it because you want to build institutional trust. Institutional trust is something that's easy to lose and hard to regain. So as much as is possible, building institutional trust actually enables not just the initial thing that you want to do to happen, but perhaps kind of like ongoing wicked problem management, if you want to put it that way. Because you're trying to educate the public. You're trying to maybe democratize what it is you're trying to do. You're trying to help people understand what it's all about. And then lastly, it's an effort to bring together different perspectives, resolve conflicts before they start, or have a process in place to address them if they emerge. There are a couple of other reasons for doing it. That's what the normative instrumental refer to. One, you can do public engagement because it's just the right thing to do, because it's consistent with democratic values. We live in a democracy. That's a normative value. You do it because it's right. Doesn't matter whether or not it's going to be helpful or unhelpful. It's just important to do. Instrumental is that there's a reason to do it to get you from here to there. There's a pragmatic reason. It might be required by law. It might be, as a means to an end. But stakeholder engagement is not necessarily just a thing that's important in and of itself, but it is in a larger context for being able to achieve something that serves. There's all kinds of stuff in this space about meaningful public participation and fake public participation. There are a lot of trust issues around the significance of stakeholder processes and whether they're real or not, and whether or not the stakeholders that are involved are advisory or directive, meaning that they actually get to affect decisions or they just get to say their piece and be quote unquote heard, and that's the end of it. There are questions about who's a stakeholder and who is a decision maker. That's an important one. And critically, and I saw this in the chat from the last session, in the United States, a lot of the work around public participation, particularly with regard to natural resources and the environment, that covers a lot of territory, including oceans, is grounded in the founding environmental legislation of this country that sets policy, sets expectations, and NEPA, which was the original piece of environmental legislation that spawned all the rest of it. You needed NEPA to set up the Environmental Protection Agency, to have a basis for the Clean Water Act, the Clean Air Act, Endangered Species Act, all the rest of it, has provisions for citizens to be involved in making the decisions that may affect them. And that's where environmental impact statements come from. That's where the idea that citizens have a right to have some input into what happens in their environmental surroundings comes from. And it's become really very powerful, not just a legal and policy idea, but it's become a very, very powerful cultural touchstone in the US. And that's really important to remember because social license comes from a different place. So social license, I pulled this out of a sustainable business report out of New Zealand, but I like the way they articulated this. Social license is social license to operate. It comes out of a business sort of foundation. It came out of mining. And the idea is that you want communities to agree to consent to a business activity, an economic activity, so that you can do it, right? They're very different from each other in the respect that one comes out of a business model, and the notion is that stakeholders give you permission, after which you have permission to operate, not necessarily a process through which there is ongoing, supervision or a way of collaborating in case unforeseen things happen, or, what rights do those stakeholders have once they've given you consent? If something happens that they change their mind or they don't like it, or a problem emerges, there's a whole different set of privileges, obligations, rights that go along with ideas of public participation and the legal and policy and even market systems that have grown up around that, and on the social license side. So one thing I would say is that if people express a kind of a discomfort with the idea of social license as stakeholders, this is partly why, because there is not as clear of a foundation. And it seems to, in fact, be in tension with what people have become used to when publics are involved in making decisions around environmental and natural resources. So as a sort of a quick, what are these things really about? Public participation, even though it's sometimes criticized as being atheoretical, is methodologically very rich, very entrepreneurial, often very ad hoc and case specific in terms of the methods. There are dozens and dozens and dozens of methods people use for this. It's grounded very much in ideas of democracy. And again, is in, hold on, I have to admit people as they come in, and some of these environmental issues that I mentioned, and is really, really focused on elevating and upholding citizen rights to involvement, to be involved, and to try to minimize the harmful effects on the environment. Social justice, social license is really focused on reducing business risks. So it involves stakeholders, but for a very different reason. It also, by the way, and last session really bore this out, it also has a long history, is entrepreneurial, is methodologically varied, can be very case focused, can be very ad hoc. Again, the ultimate goal is a little different. Okay, so this is a little bit of an image that about how social license operates, and you can see that, again, it's a little bit binary. It's an effort to achieve consent. There's a rejection or agreement, consent and acceptance, versus lack of acceptance and rejection and withdrawal. And then the idea is, how do you get from that rejection to that acceptance or approval? And sometimes that can leave out some other questions that people really care about, that the public engagement field has been contending with for decades. So then we get to justice, which is something that really hasn't been discussed very much. Will talked about it in terms of equity. This is from an article that came out recently that had to do with carbon dioxide or direct air capture. But the framework actually applies to any kind of CDR, and it can apply to us as well. But I draw your attention here to the fact that the categories, if you think back to the slide that I showed you that had the reasons for doing public engagement, these are some of the reasons for doing justice, for doing environmental justice. Because you want to deal with some of the local equity issues, you want to deal with global equity issues, and you want to deal with intergenerational issues, right? So right away, as soon as we start talking about things like this, what are we adding into the picture? We're talking about social structures that systematically include or exclude certain people from being stakeholders or being decision makers. So this is kind of an overlay on both public engagement, public participation, and on social license. This talks about the importance of operating at several scales at once, the local, the global. This talks about the importance of intertemporal stakeholders and decision makers and equity and values. So we're talking about the intergenerational piece of it. So if you're thinking in terms of justice, it is even harder to try to imagine whose consent you need to be able to do something if there is no process in place for revisiting, for recalibrating, for course correcting down the road. And for a lot of the things that we're talking about with Ocean CDR, we're talking about very complex environmental systems where the stakeholders and the sense of belonging and you can call it ownership or rights are very varied and very inclusive beyond any particular country, where local communities and global communities have shared interests, and sometimes they're not the same. I mean, they both have interests, they're not necessarily always the same. And we're talking about long time frames with very, very complex systems, which really raises the bar significantly on the stakeholder processes that would need to be in place and the kinds of legal and policy and market systems that would need to be in place that would be able to contend with these things, both in the near term and in the long term. As just a quick example, another thing that comes up here is, in the planning field and planning literature, there's a long-standing debate and discussion concern about whether local communities that steward natural resources are sufficient as decision makers and stakeholders, because sometimes local environments have global impacts. Some cases that you would be used to thinking about would be the Amazon rainforest or the prairie pothole region in the US, where a lot of waterfowl are born, and so it affects all of North America. Oceans and anything else that can be classified as a global commons certainly falls into that. Okay, and let's see. So I'm going to pass this over to Brad because I know that he's going to be talking about, he's going to take these airy-fairy ideas and bring them to a more tangible place. But I want to just make sure that as we're walking away from this, we sort of recognize that, and everybody already does recognize that these things are not particularly simple. But what I want to put out here is that they're not simple because there's some very important, reasonable, and deep foundations that we need to be bringing to the surface and working with in order to come up with the governance systems that can create the environments within which experimentation and innovation and research and laws and policy and regulation can all occur. So Brad, I am going to stop my screen sharing if you would like to start. Can you unmute yourself and let me know?
I'm unmuted. Thank you. And thank you, Will, and the whole crew at the Institute. It's really good to see this coming together. I am going to share screen here. One moment. Here it is. And I apologize for it's a little bit crowded here, but I think you can see. What I'm going to talk about is really the rise of Indian tribes, particularly in the Northwest, and their potential role not only broadly in ocean and coastal management, where they're really quite a power now, but in defining the future of ocean CDR. They sit at the intersection of all of these issues that Elizabeth was just defining, and they are, I think it's fair to say, exceptionally good at building things for keeps. They've come a long ways from where many of us first encountered them a few decades ago. And it's important to understand that for anyone who thinks they're going to do some work in the ocean around the Northwest, and really largely in many other places, because the precedents that have been set in this region defined rights and authorities that go, it's frankly no longer appropriate, and they'll tell you this, to call them stakeholders. They're governments. They have management authorities. They have more than just a say. They're really significant players. They have big technical capacity. They're no longer, by any stretch, kind of primitive, disempowered people as players in this kind of discussion. There are areas where their societies don't function very well, plenty, but this is one place they've got some significant chops. And just for background, I run the National Fisheries Conservation Center. It's a small research and education organization based in Seattle, founded to do two kinds of work. We do collaborative problem solving, and we do kind of scouting to help folks on the waterfront, tribes, fishermen, fishery managers, resource management agencies, local coastal communities engaged in living off the water, kind of get in front of change. For 15 years or so, the center of our work has been around the carbon crisis and what it means for the future of the ocean and rivers and their ability to make lunch for 3 billion people or so. So that's our work. We've done a bit of work with tribes, and I'm going to start out by looking at a question about how tribes came from here, where they were in ramshackle, worn-out buildings and didn't amount to much of a power on the landscape, to here, where we have a photo of the headquarters of the Tulalip tribes, one of the more powerful tribes here around Seattle. There are 400 people working in that building. They are they own some casinos and other businesses, telecommunications, real estate holdings. They're a major employer in their valley. I think they're the second largest. And to understand that transition, you kind of have to go back in history and go to this time when what people thought they were fighting about was fishing rights. And it turns out what they did was very clever in getting their rights to fish recognized. The fellow in the photograph here next to Marlon Brando on the right, I believe that's a young Billy Frank, if I'm not mistaken, who was shown in the first slide. Billy was a mentor to many people and a real leader among the treaty tribes of Western Washington in building a common platform for establishing their authorities as managers and users of the resource. And it went way beyond fish. What they did eventually, by winning recognition of a sovereign treaty authority to a share of the fish in the Bolt decision in 1974, a very famous case, they also won recognition of the foundations of their sovereignty. They weren't just a bunch of people living on the coast making trouble and complaining about fishing rights. They were a government with authorities, and the architects of their power, some of them are shown here. I could go on about who they are, but I'll skip forward. One of these fellows, the gentleman with the ponytail here on the left, is Terry Williams. He serves on our board. There's a history. This is borrowed from the Northwest Indian Fisheries Commission, which is a group that has been a key agent of their work in fisheries and ocean resource management and climate response and a number of other things. They're a very important organization based in Olympia. They won the Volt decision. It established an entitlement to half the fish, and it established that underpinning that they have this sovereign right. That was upheld. It went on in 1980. They won I think we heard some mention of this earlier. They won recognition of an implied right to protect the habitat that makes the fish. And that's the ORIC decision of 1980, sometimes referred to as Bolt Phase 2. That got kind of large, and they've been very astute at stewarding these powers. There's no real statutes underpinning implementing rules for the treaties that they live by, and that's probably not a mistake. They've been very careful in stewarding that right. Case law is where they're working this, and they've been choosing their cases carefully. In a case that they have been triumphant in repeatedly, they essentially won an affirmation from courts that the state is responsible to fix broken culverts running under highways and so forth that block salmon migration. Very proximate, very clear cut, not vague, not based on model results. This is obvious. This blocked thousands and thousands of miles of habitat that produced fish that they depended on, and they won. They've forced the state into a major piece of work to fix that. In the early 2000s, an interesting application of this broad authority that the tribes acquired was that nice white environmentalists came along and said, we know how to look after the ocean, and we need to close off large parts of it, including the parts where you fish, and make them into marine protected areas. And as they have done repeatedly since then, the tribes said, one, we have treaty rights. Two, we've been thrown off the water by white people many times. Three, you don't get to do it this time. And if you want to have a serious conversation about how marine protected areas can play in recovering fish populations, which was the claim of the environmentalists, then here are some standards you're going to have to meet. And if you can't meet them, you can just go away and come back when you have a plan that actually makes sense. And that put an end to a movement to create, a really substantial, high momentum movement to create MPAs all around Puget Sound. The main sort of Chesapeake Bay style inlet in Washington State. What happened after that was fascinating, because the tribes didn't just say, no, go away. They said, basically, we'll show you how it's done. And they took the concept of spatial conservation and they charged into leadership, and they built many, many, many important coastal restoration projects that are fundamentally spatial conservation places where you protect and restore estuaries, parts of rivers, coastlines that are key habitat. And they defined what it is to do that. They built for the long run. They undertook the incredible, grueling, difficult permit getting and hoop jumping and dealing with the Corps of Engineers. And they got, all these big projects going, including one that I showed in the first slide next to Billy Frank. I'll go back to that. Hang on. Here. This is a little piece of fish running around inside one of the largest restoration projects, this big estuary at the mouth of the Nisqually River. Now, a restoration project named after Billy. But they said, basically, we're not against conservation. We want it done in a way that respects who we are, what our authorities are, and how the resources actually work. Do this so that it's for real and for keeps, and we're in. At this point, they're not real active on carbon removal conversations yet. That will come. And we're doing some work to help stimulate that conversation in tribes with the hope that they will take leadership. They have significant powers and authorities to be both government deciders about how this works and to be project developers. They have real technical capacities. At this point, and I'll close with this slide, we've seen tribes become real shapers of international conventions. They've had a big role in defining parts of the Convention on Biological Diversity. They've had a big role in defining parts of the Intellectual Property Convention in order to prevent the arrogation of tribal intellectual property into public domain and private patenting. That's an example of how these societies moved from not even recognized. Billy Frank went to jail 90 times to win their fishing rights in protest fishing. That's what happens to people who weren't recognized as having any right to do what they have always done. Having won that, it laid the foundation for them ultimately to have a seat at the table at the UN and to have a voice in a lot of issues. They are defining forces in large parts of marine policy now in this region. And this is both as a matter of law, as a matter of moral authority, and finally, really as a pragmatic matter. If you want to get things done in the Northwest that involve using the water, they're going to have something to say about it. And it's a really smart idea. And they will tell you this. Start early, give them time to ramp up and become involved, and don't walk away when it takes time, because it does. One key lesson I can say from our own experiences: You write a letter inviting people to a meeting and they don't come, don't write them off. That's not going to cut it. That's not consultation. There are actually procedures and guidelines about what constitutes consultation, and they're required. And it's significant what it takes. And is it worth it? For us, it is. I think that the tribes have been instrumental in achieving some of the best improvements in environmental management that we've seen in my lifetime. They could be significant leaders both in governing and in doing carbon removal in the ocean. And I think, the world will be a better place if they are. I'll leave it at that.
That's great, Brad. Thank you. So I want to move into a Q&A, but before we do that, I'd like to ask the folks on this panel, so that would be Will and Brad and myself. Do you have any questions that you want to ask somebody else on the panel before we move on? Because I have some, so I'll start. Brad, how do you think about I'm not even sure what the word is to use, the proportion, how do you think about the presence, the size of the presence of tribes with regard to oceans in the Pacific Northwest? How do you think about that?
Well, if you think in terms of ocean and marine resource management, they're one of the most significant players. One way of putting that is that it's either the number 1 or number 2 largest number of salmon hatcheries in the region. I forget whether it's 1 or 2. I mean, they far outstrip all but the state of Washington, which has a large number of them. I think they may have more than that. No federal agency, no other entity has as many. And that's a testimony to how vested permanently they are in this resource. They're not all about hatcheries, but when you destroy habitat, you have no other option but to make sure you still have fish. If you're salmon people by definition, and they are, they probably employ more master's and PhD level technical staff than any entity in this region outside of for marine resource management, outside of NOAA, and maybe more even than the Washington Department of Fisheries, which is the major state agency for this. When they started out basically as a bunch of Indians protest fishing, it was hard for people to see that they would become the stewards who stand up for the resource in the 7th-generation context. They were viewed as depredators, as stringing their nets across rivers. Lots of white people were opposed to their rise, and because it took fish from them, for one thing. They had arrogated the resource to themselves. Many of my friends in the white fishing world were mad as hell, and what happened is, over time, the umbrella that the tribe spread over the resource and the habitat to protect it and manage it better became something everyone's standing under.
So you've said that the tribes can become innovators and implementers with regard to ocean CDR. In the previous session or two, what we heard was that there are a number of organizations that are starting up. Some are for profit, some are not for profit, but they're generally technology innovators and entrepreneurs. How would you imagine the relationship between that sort of an entity, that sort of organization, that might want to either collaborate with tribes or may have identified an area as being perfect for what their particular strategy, where it could be cited, but where that area is under the stewardship or within the treaty rights area of a tribe? How do you imagine that relationship or that dynamic occurring?
Well, I would start out by saying slow and patient. tribes have a lot on their plate. There are no busier people anywhere in the world than the folks who run their natural resource management facilities and operations. They are neck deep all the time and running hard. Start with patience and be clear in recognizing that they will have a lot to do with defining the future of this activity, and also not just because of their authorities, but because of their capacities. They led the way in developing some of the biological statistical techniques in fishery management. They led the way in the use of GIS in natural resource management in this region. They are among the leaders in the application of genetics to the most complicated wildlife tracking problem in the world, which is tracking salmon as they migrate from thousands of rivers and streams out into the Pacific and back, and at what rate they're caught where, so that you don't wear them out with the fisheries that subsist on them. One could go on. I mean, as a matter of technical capacity, when it comes to marine resource management, they're definitely leaders, and they have a permanent vested interest in looking after the future of these resources. And in 2018, we did some work with tribes, helping them identify their key priorities and understand how to pursue them through the development of strong carbon pricing policy, price and invest policy specifically. That policy, largely bearing the print of that work, passed this year. And it's likely that tribes will receive a significant earmarked part of the funding to do things that help solve the carbon crisis. CDR is a piece of the toolkit that nobody had in mind when we were all building the pieces of that policy puzzle, but it fits. And the people who are best positioned to define how it will fit are probably tribes, and best positioned to implement, in part because they will have a significant share of the funding to do things to make a difference. And frankly, to go back to your point about the long view, building things that last, that's the institutional memory of tribes goes back not hundreds of years, not decades, but tens of thousands of years. I stood on the banks of the Puyallup River once with Billy Frank, the gentleman in that first slide, and he showed me the hummocks left by the side of the river where his people once lived back during the ice ages. Their memory goes back that far. Some people tell me stories that go back to before the ice ages. I mean, that's how far they think. That's the sense of time in which they live. If you're going to do something as permanent as CDR at scale, that's the kind of mind you want in the room at a minimum, in the leadership optimally.
So I want to make an observation just to throw more terminology onto the table. In the way that you're talking about tribes and their capacities and the idea of consulting with them. So you talked about being able to benefit from their long and deep expertise, right? Which on the surface sounds like the public engagement goal of substantive improvement of outcomes. But actually, you're talking about something different. There is that, but I think you're talking about a kind of a consultation that takes that assumes the tribes are full partners, right? That they're not stakeholders in decisions somebody else will make, but that they're full partners in consulting together, which points to something that is increasingly considered to be a co-design question, right? So where you're recognizing kind of a shared sense of public interest or of justice or of long-term stewardship or whatever that value system is underneath, but that you're trying to, so you're talking about not just sort of working with them, consulting with them to see if you can try out your CDR idea, one's CDR idea, but to actually engage in deep consultation with them to design the CDR approaches in a way that will likely be effective in managing carbon, as well as good for the oceans, and have a system in place for being able to think backwards and forwards in time to the intergenerational interests that may, be implicated. Is that
I
a
think
fair?
that's right, and I'd go one step farther.
Mhm.
And really, I'll say the best people to make this case are not me, an outsider who has done some work with tribes, right?
Mhm.
I'm not their spokesman. I'm someone who has written about them and worked with them over the years. But they are, frankly, we were hoping some of them could come and join us today. And there were some illnesses and conflicts in schedules. But frankly, they can speak for themselves just fine. But I think it's fair to say that this could go further, another step further. And it's not just co-management, co-design. These people have true leadership, true permanent vested interest in these resources and their vitality, a commitment that does not stop. They will, if this goes the way other things have gone, I expect them to become leaders, designers, owners, full stop, not necessarily with a co-attached.
Right. Yeah, thanks for all of that, Brad. Will, can I ask you a couple questions?
Yeah.
All right. One of them is we mentioned, but we haven't really delved into the global aspect and the way that human rights may be the conceptual framework that captures that sort of a global scale, the same sorts of things we're talking about in terms of social license and engagement and justice. How do you view that? Does that seem, is there a relationship that we should be thinking about?
Well, I think human rights has a role to play, and maybe a critical role to play, as we think about deployment of CDR approaches. I've written about human rights in the context of BACs, right? So a terrestrial approach, but I think it could also be applicable in the context of some of these ocean-based approaches. And the reason that I think that human rights are important in this context is, first of all, they can protect individual interests that aren't necessarily protected by government elites, even in the global South, in a way that can be important. And second of all, they often provide an actual legal route to protect those rights in a way that public deliberation alone, for example, may not, right? So in many cases, when we engage in environmental impact assessments, often human rights-based assessments will be a component of that, right? So if some of these approaches potentially had a negative impact in terms of subsistence rights or right to food, or other such interests, it ensures a way to consider them. Conversely, if unchecked climate change potentially could, and obviously will, have negative impacts in terms of human rights, it can provide a rationale for the use of carbon dioxide removal approaches under some circumstances to protect interests such as the right to food, or the right to health, and so it provides, in my mind, a powerful framework both to protect individual interests, but also to ensure that we balance interests and recognize trade-offs in a way that we might not otherwise do. So yeah, I do think they have a role to play.
So, internationally, human rights, that, I mean, there are some enforcement mechanisms. It varies a bit. And I'm curious to know whether you think that human rights regimes could potentially provide a sort of a foundation for coming up with, I'll say, consistent criteria. I don't know if that's the word I want to use, for being able to work with communities around the world. So one of the things that I stressed in my comments earlier is that some of the foundations of public participation they really are very rooted in a somewhat uniquely American history of believing deeply in democracy and the legal and policy systems that grow out of that. For ocean CDR, we're talking about, especially if we're talking about seeking social license for local individual projects, you're talking potentially about building stakeholder or consultation mechanisms with a variety of communities all over the world, from a lot of different societies with different, ethical and policy and legal histories. So we may not have the basis as we sit here for a common language or a common sort of procedure for doing that kind of stakeholder or partner consultation in different countries. Brad's example of working with sovereign nations, in the US context, just starts to hint at that. But if we're talking about going to other continents, how do we think about that? Because there, social license is the language that's being used. What is the underpinning there? And does human rights or some other sort of global perspective provide, a common approach, a common, conceptual model for how to do it?
Yeah, I mean, I think it has a role to play. These human rights, either the soft law principles, declarations, and things like that, through treaty-based protections, have been embraced by a large number of countries, right? And there's caveats around that. There may still be different conceptions of those rights when one starts to try to operationalize them. And obviously, in many cases, human rights are violated, obviously, sometimes blatantly, despite the fact that these mechanisms exist. But you can say that about virtually any legal principle in the world. But what they do is they provide some common language and some institutionalized mechanisms, often to review potential violations that don't otherwise exist. And so I do think they provide a framework. And then in some instances, they also provide the ability to engage in comparative sort of assessment of rights in terms of their saliency. And that might be extremely important in the context of CDR, where we have to confront trade-offs in many cases, especially at this point.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so we're going to move to just open Q&A in a couple of minutes. I want to ask you, I think, one more thing, Will, but you can substitute for this should we have asked you anything else that we did not, if you don't like what I'm going to ask you now. But you presented 4 options that are, by and large, considered to be the most viable of ocean-based CDR, types of ocean-based CDR. And you commented a little bit as you presented them about some of the scientific assessments about whether or not they work and what some of the risks might be if they don't go quite as planned. And I'm wondering, in light of the urgency of climate solutions, and in light of the somewhat complexity and the lack of maybe a universal way of thinking about social justice or public engagement or justice consultation, co-design, shared leadership, is the discussion about these social and political issues, is it a hindrance to coming up with solutions that will fix the climate problem? Or are they critical to sort out in order to fix the climate problem?
Do you mean is carbon removal potentially a hindrance in terms of action?
No, if there are CDR options out there and there is some question about which ones work and which ones don't, someone's going to have to make decisions about the trade-offs and risks that are acceptable and not, right? So and whether or not they should be deployed and under what circumstances. So in that kind of an environment in which the time pressures to do something about climate change are getting only more intense by the day, is the discussion about public engagement and justice and CDR a hindrance to that, or is it somehow a critical piece of that?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think you can answer that a couple of ways. I mean, one is, I think that even if you acknowledge that that we're in a place where we need to mobilize extremely quickly, and we need to look at carbon removal approaches. I think if you don't provide the scaffolding of public education about why we need to do this and what the trade-offs are, and provide some mechanisms for the public to engage in that, there's likely to be a huge backlash that'll slow down research, slow down potential deployment in the longer term. We've seen this in the context of other technologies where government has simply said, we've got to move, get out of the way. The public almost invariably has a way of keeping that from happening. And so if you're purely thinking of this pragmatically, not even looking at notions of justice and equity, I think it's important to do. The other thing that we've seen in the past is that it's usually been advantageous to provide the perspectives of stakeholders, because they often discuss and present notions of risk that have not been thought of in terms of government decision making, that can be extremely important to incorporate into these things. And it's important to have the public involved to try, at the very least, to try to ameliorate these risks in a way that might not have happened otherwise. And so even though we obviously need to move very quickly at this point, because we didn't do the kind of things that were necessary to rapidly decarbonize the economy and now have to rely to a very large degree on these technologies. I don't see us getting around having to create these processes and to create them as quickly as we can.
Yeah, that was a provocative question. You handled that really well. Let's open this up to everybody. And I would say, I mean, there are 43 people participating right now. This can get a little messy, but the easiest thing really could be to, as you choose, you can type into the chat or just unmute yourself and speak up. So people in the chat have been talking about the value of environmental impact statements or environmental impact assessments as a useful framework that, although kind of developed in the US, have been used in other places as well. Someone's talking about the Convention on Biological Diversity and its instructions to include Indigenous peoples and their knowledge in the process of conserving and sharing the benefits of biodiversity. There's a question to everyone, given the complexity of defining appropriate stakeholders, how do we best define an impacted community? You focus on communities that live near the Ocean CDR project or something more beyond that, which is a huge kind of question. Who gets to decide what's meaningful participation? Yeah, Anybody that wants to jump in verbally? And sure, keep the chats coming, because part of what we're doing in this Q&A discussion is where we are crowdsourcing. We are at the moment engaging in a sort of a public participation process where we are looking for your best ideas about the kinds of questions that really should be dealt with in this space, because it's really not very well developed at this point, to be able to answer some of the questions that you're writing into the chat, to be able to reach the aspirations that Will is talking about in creating mechanisms that can in fact allow for strengthening and facilitating and accelerating these solutions that will work and not create bigger problems as they go. There's a lot of work to be done. This is social R&D. We're talking about social R&D that takes into account all of the kinds of concepts and some that we haven't talked about that we've been talking about in this session. So let's see, Brad and Will, if you want to look at the chat yourselves and see if there's anything in there that you'd like to address. And again, if anybody would like to just unmute themselves and verbally put something out here into the discussion, please feel free.
The thing I'll throw out is that, for better or worse, we have a natural experiment probably already occurring, certainly evident in many other fields kind of adjacent to this one. In autocratic societies, you don't get inclusion and consultation. You get armed forces moving in and taking over your land, dispossessing the people who live and work there and harvest food there, and turning it into whatever the elite want. That's just how things work in large parts of the world. I'm not saying it's good. It's what is. And so we get to watch. And I think if you look at the history, for example, of shrimp farming in autocratic countries, it evolved rapidly, became price competitive, grabbed a big market share, and then eventually the buyers, the major buyers in the West said, nah, you're going to have to show some better environmental and social performance, and they've been cleaning up their act. And it's for real. They're doing it. They have to. I think it supports Will's point that in the long run, the pure capital power of open, successful democratic societies forces, through market pressure in significant parts of environmental policy development now, it forces improvements where they don't start in the beginning. And that might be okay for something as minor as growing shrimp. When you're talking about CDR, where it is, as Will was saying, it's the health of the earth, the ability of the ocean to make lunch for millions, billions of people. It's the entire viability of life on Earth. Is it really okay to allow that natural experiment to play out, or do we need a better governance system to start?
Yes, when you talked about the natural experiment of autocratic societies kind of forcing solutions, my students ask that question. Students ask that question quite a bit. Can democratic societies actually do this? Or do you need an autocratic society in order to be able to deal with the time urgency, with the small window? And it's a really interesting and important question to ask. And some of the chat questions that people are asking they point to that in a different way. So people are asking, who should be leading the community outreach and engagement process? What mechanisms have been defined or are being defined to create robust engagement? What tools are being considered? Who should be doing this? So who should be doing this public engagement? What sector, at what scale or scales? Where does the R&D for this happen? Where do the experiments about what works happen, and who should be paying for that? Where does that investment come from? So investors know that there's a well-tested system for investing in technology development that can be commercialized, right? Or for investing in certain strategies that may yield valuable things related to carbon credits. But how do you make money, or who invests in developing processes for social engagement that might facilitate and accelerate CDR but that are not themselves monetizable.
Hi, I just wanted to chime in. This is Nicholas Kane from California.
Mhm.
And I just appreciate the conversation. I mean, I would put to the panel that the question of how do we adapt or how do we deal with the reality? Or let me start with this. What is the likelihood that a large-scale CDR project will just be done without global governance, global buy-in, UN conventions, global level environmental impact assessment? I mean, is there a likelihood that one of the large emitters, China, the US, European Union, will just embark on a project?
Will, I know you've been thinking about this.
I mean, I guess it depends on how large scale we're talking about, right? We often think about this in the context of solar radiation management, right? Where if you put, sulfur dioxide in the stratosphere and potentially alter global climates, right? CDR projects often more limited in scale. Maybe that's the good news, right? But some of them potentially in the oceans could have very large impacts and potentially irreversible impacts. I don't know. I think that's an open question. I mean, one of the things that I am worried about is that you do have private project developers that are engaged in limited field research at this point, but have aspirations to develop extremely large projects that some of whom are not asking the questions about who they should be consulting and how they would scaffold questions of monitoring and verification, the things that we talked about in the last panel. And I think it's really important that kind of foundation be established at this point. And quite frankly, if we have public engagement and further public education that helps the public to realize that these developments are occurring, it's likely that they will put more pressure on public officials to assume some oversight of those projects and ensure that doesn't happen, right? But I think the jury is out at this point, and that's one of the reasons that I think a conference like this is important, is to talk about how we ensure that regulatory process is put in place concomitantly with early research and development, and certainly if we decide to go down the route of deployment.
I have a slightly different answer to that. It's not in conflict with what Will said, it's just a little different. One of the things that has become a kind of clear, but it's really hard to track because the information isn't always readily available, is that because people tend to think that because scientifically we bin CDR into one category, that somehow there's like a policy domain for CDR. But that's actually not, I think, how it's evolving. I think how it's evolving is that there are different policy domains, different regulatory structures, different rules, different ways of getting permits for different kinds of activities. And so if you're doing something that is similar to something else that's already being done, for which there are already rules and permit processes, you could be doing something that, could be defined as CDR, but you're doing it and it's called something else. It could be called, ecosystem restoration, or it could be called, mining, or it could be called something else. And there is some evidence that those things are already happening. Whether those are things that are happening at scale or could happen at scale, I think is a different question. But I think that there's a lot of reason to to view this as not a monolithic space, but as a diverse space where there are a lot of different actors working at a lot of different levels in a lot of different spaces, and that things are going to be cumulatively happening at the experimental level or maybe larger, and it's a little bit hard to see right now where that could go. Brad, did you have anything you want to say about that?
Oh, I think I'll hold off, but I noted that John Fitzgerald has raised some interesting points
Yeah.
in the comments about the extent to which shrimp as a globally traded commodity has become a driver for environmental law development. And I think there are some interesting precedents in that. And it could be that it's worth a look at that and other commodities that have been the subject of maybe trade-driven environmental improvements in policy to see, do they hold precedent that could be applied here.
Right, and you brought up specifically the World Trade Organization. So there are other actors, right? There are other institutional actors out there that could be an umbrella under which some decisions that are relevant, are being made and could be made. I'm just scrolling through the chat here. So if anybody else wants to jump in and say something on the panel or off the panel, go for it. I wonder if I can be a mean moderator and buttonhole a participant. Are we allowed to do that? Willow, is that against the rules?
Yeah, I think it's okay.
Okay. Amelia Meyer, are you still here?
Hi, yes, I'm here.
Hi. Yeah, so you have this question. In your opinion, what are the environmental justice benefits from nature-based solutions? Do they outweigh economic benefits or sequestration benefits of technology-based solutions? Can you just talk a little bit about what you're thinking there?
Sure, yeah. Thanks for, what did you call it? Button holding?
Yeah.
Yeah, but yeah, I work on like looking at different aspects of CDR in relation to environmental justice. And so I'm just curious what you think, some of the benefits are of different nature-based solutions, whether it's looking at kelp or seagrass or mangrove restoration projects, versus looking at electrochemical processes or processes with more technology-based thinking. So how do those kind of compare in terms of environmental justice, but also in terms of economic investment and the sequestration? So it's kind of a large question, but I guess the main ideas are just, do you think that the environmental justice benefits from these nature-based solutions, whether it's because it can involve lower skill jobs or coastal communities or indigenous tribes or different types of communities, and how that will benefit their economic and environmental and social spheres? Does this outweigh what these technologically based ocean CDR, what they're trying to promise for sequestration and for economic benefits?
My quick response to that would be that we would actually need, and I would really love to see and be involved in developing a way of being able to compare those things, because ideally you're not in a situation where you're trading it off, so that you have to decide, do I want the environmental justice benefits more than the economic benefits, or that the social justice benefits may go along with strategies that are maybe not as good on the carbon management side compared to some of the others. I mean, there should be a way to look at these things so that we can get the most justice, the most resilience, the most carbon management, the most protective solutions that we can, and maybe not have to be deciding or thinking that we have to decide one for the other. But the nature-based solutions, and ocean CDR is certainly one of them. I think that we have to be really careful about the fact that there are strong public interests around natural resources, and that we can't actually ignore that. So to some degree, the choices that we make or what we choose to do, to Will's point, we'll need to take into account the public interests involved in the justice issues, because those will, on some level, make or break the feasibility of them long term. But Will, did you have thoughts about this?
Yeah, I mean, I guess one thing that's important to emphasize is, at a risk of saying this, I think we sometimes fetishize nature-based solutions when it comes to CDR at our peril. If we look at least in the terrestrial context, for example, a lot of times people will come to me and say, well, why would we do direct air capture or bioenergy with carbon capture when we have tree planting, right? It's something we already do, and there's co-benefits and so forth. And the reality is that if you look at large-scale afforestation and reforestation projects and where we're likely to do them, in a lot of cases, we're targeting prairie grasslands and savannas. We're targeting areas that are deemed to be non-productive, that turn out to have a lot of people, including indigenous peoples, that rely on those areas heavily for their livelihoods. And it's largely being driven by elites who want to plant large-scale eucalyptus forests with virtually no biodiversity whatsoever to suck up a lot of carbon credits from the voluntary carbon market, right? And so it's not necessarily more just because it's natural, and that's something that we have to look at in all contexts. Even so-called blue carbon approaches, there's been lots of discussion that some of these projects to try to increase mangrove development or seaweed development in coastal communities have been at the peril of local fishing communities that might necessarily being crowded out as a consequence of taking up that acreage, as it were, for large-scale sort of microalgae development. And so I think whether it's a quote-unquote natural or industrial CDR approach, one still has to look at who the critical stakeholders are, what the livelihood implications are of the projects, how could one ameliorate those if possible by designing the projects in different ways, and at what scale can they be done at to not pass critical thresholds in terms of notions of justice or sustainability. But I think in both the natural and industrial case, that has to be done. If you look at RED also, there's lots of literature that talks about huge human rights violations and land grabs that have happened as a consequence of those projects, even though they would be deemed to be natural.
Yeah, you know, we have about 7 minutes left in the session. So if anybody in the who's participating, aside from the panel, feels they have something burning they really want to say that hasn't been captured in the chat, jump in as I read this, and we will do that in order. There are a couple questions that have come in here that I'm pretty sure are going to close out the session. So one of them is that, yeah, it could be that having programmatic environmental impact assessments or technology assessments that are designed so that they can actually compare the benefits and costs of different methods in different settings would be a good idea. And I'm just going to say thumbs up. I totally agree with that, at least as a tool and a place to start. It doesn't displace the need for consultation or engagement, but it certainly would be great to have a little bit more, some more tools available to be able to think through some of the benefits and trade-offs and other aspects of some of the options that we have. There's a question about, are there any case studies, examples of the most successful projects where authentic, impactful stakeholder engagement speeded up deployment and actual project success? I'm gonna put that out there for Brad and Will, anybody else to think about. those would be great case studies to try to pull together. And then last but not least, given that Silicon Valley has reawoken to the climate crisis and is plowing money into new startups doing CDR, and given that historically many Silicon Valley darlings tend to quote unquote move fast and break things, what advice would you have for these companies? How do we balance speed to innovation with authentic stakeholder engagement, trust building, and alignment, which takes time? That's a great, I mean, those are all great observations and questions.
Jump on the first of those quickly, just by saying, I hope we get to see those case studies or help make them. I don't think it's time yet because not enough's been done. But in 5 years, 10 years, I hope that that book gets written and that those conferences occur. It's a great question. It's worth the work.
What about the
I think there's going to have to be a substantial role for governments in structuring these kind of public engagement strategies that we're talking about. A number of people in the chats have mentioned things like the Intergovernmental Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystems processes, the CBD processes, for example, that provide specific guidelines and mandates largely to be driven by governments. And I think that's going to be critical. If you look at the private sector's role in this, I don't think they view that as their role. I don't think they're particularly adept at it. And they're probably not, given their interests, the best ones to be facilitating that process. I prefer them to have a respect for that process and provide critical information for the public deliberative process. But I think government's going to have to be integral in structuring these processes.
Are they going to be multi-sectoral? So I'm thinking the folks that are participants that are themselves part of a Silicon Valley supported CDR startup, right? They may not like this conversation, or they may think it's great. And there are people who I know that have been working on climate change for a long time, who are really concerned that the current federal administration in the US is somehow not going to be able to make the kind of progress that I think would be required, to set up those sorts of governance systems to allow the combination of mechanisms and analytics to happen, right? To set that stage. So what would be, thinking about it multi-sectorally, since there are stakeholders in every sector, and there are stakeholders in this case, everybody is. What would be some next steps for being able to make any of this happen? Setting the stage for developing those case studies, for doing the analytics, for trying to consult with each other to set up the mechanisms for being able to do this sort of meaningful and valuable work to accelerate and facilitate. We have 2 minutes. What would be, Will and Brad, what would be your 1 or 2 best ideas about the most productive things that could happen?
You want to go first, Brad, or?
Well, I'll just say quickly, I think it's a parallel process. On one hand, we need to be doing the lab work and then the very contained pilot studies to test out some of these technical approaches and develop validation and measurement mechanisms. All of these things have been discussed. And at the same time, not later, we need to be developing the policy frameworks for this to be done well and done for keeps. I don't think we want to wait for that to happen in the kind of clumsy, clunky, often hideous way. Lots of harm that happens when we don't build frameworks for that.
I think he saved you from having to say anything, Will, so you're fine. I'll just kind of close that out by saying that what you're talking about then, Brad, and it seems that what's required is what we in the biz call policy entrepreneurship, right? So technology entrepreneurship isn't enough. Technology innovation isn't enough. Market innovation isn't enough. We actually need policy innovation. And the question is, where is that going to come from? It is 15 after. I believe the session is officially over.
All right. Thank you so much, Elisa. Obviously, a lot of these questions are in the infant stages in terms of being thought about and any effort to scaffold. But I think they're critical questions, and so I'm hoping that a lot of the members of this community will start to try to actively discuss what mechanisms we think we can put in place to start facilitating this, because as the last panel emphasized, there's a need for governance to simultaneously proceed with research. I think in parallel with that, there's a critical need for these kind of processes to occur and to impact both of those processes. And so I'd like to thank Elisa for setting up this panel and for the thoughtful questions involved. So we are at another break stage. We will reconvene for our final part of the program at 4:30 Eastern. This will be a presentation as opposed to a panel. And it will focus on research governance for ocean-based carbon dioxide removal, primarily with the perspective from the NGO sector, and most notably the NRDC, which has been thinking a lot about its role in carbon dioxide removal and what the component should be specifically for scaffolding the research phase of CDR. So I'd like to encourage everybody to come back in about 12 minutes for that presentation. So thank you very much, everyone.